author of The Dark Thorn and the editor on Unfettered. And I'm here today with author Peter Orullian. He's a Tor Books author who has been making a name for himself writing epic fantasy. And his debut novel, The Unremembered, came out several years ago and is widely reviewed online with very good reviews. And his second book, Trial of Intentions, is coming out this Tuesday. So, Peter, thanks for coming into this chat.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thank you.
How you doing?
I'm tired, to be honest. But this will be fun. I just barely walked in the door from work, so.
Cool. Now, you work at Microsoft full-time as well as writing. How do you balance the two? We'll start there with a craft question. How do you balance the two?
Well, I think I've said this a lot, that I get up early. I get up at 3:30 to write before I head into work. So, you know, I buy 5-hour energy drink by the gross at Costco.
I bet.
But then I just write in the morning. That's my routine. I don't care about word count. I don't care about page count. And that time is both, if it's needed, it's also my research time. Although a lot of the research is done before that I start the writing. Although invariably there's things that crop up that need to be researched. But all I care about is that I put the time in. And some mornings there's probably lots and lots of words, and some mornings there's nothing because I'll hit something where I've got to go and do some research. So it's more about the dedication of the routine than it is words or pages.
Great. What's you mentioned research, and you know, it's funny. We're writing fiction, and fiction you would think that you'd be able to just make stuff up, but like Lester Del Rey said, you have to make things plausible. So the reader can be truly invested in the world. What's the hardest thing you've had to research when it comes to your work?
The hardest thing? Well, in Trial of Intentions, it's kind of a departure. It's going to be a departure for a lot of the readers of The Unremembered, because I had this idea, and we can debate if it was a good idea or not, but I had this idea that I'm very passionate about the field and the genre, and the notion I had was that I would write a series that began with familiar conventions, some people call them tropes, as a gateway to the genre. You know, especially now with things like Lord of the Rings and, you know, Game of Thrones, the genre's been popularized enough that some of the things that are some of it has become familiar to the general populace. And of course, the media has done a good job, film and television, of bringing new readers, I think, and I hope, to the genre. But in my own way, you know, and before those things, I had this idea. So I deliberately leveraged some of the conventions of the genre in the first book. But the idea was always then to take the reader into what I think is unique about my series and my world. And so with Trial of Intentions, some of the expectations that readers probably have, and this is deliberate on my part, are going to be violated. And you know, this kind of across the board. And you know, to get back to your question, I did a lot of research for book 2 in areas that I didn't really do any schooling. So physics, mathematics. I mean, I took some calculus in college, but mathematics, astronomy, and I'm a bit of an amateur astronomer, but that doesn't take me near as far as I needed to go. And then, you know, some cosmology and philosophy. I did quite a bit of philosophy. But the point I'm making is these sciences, I had to go deep on some of these sciences to find authentic details and to build out the plot that really turns one of the characters from farm boy, orphan farm boy that people are expecting, to quite the opposite. And some of that was very challenging because, you know, I'm not a physicist.
Right. But the one discipline that you really know is music.
Yeah.
We might as well get this question out of the way right now. Brent Weeks wrote me this morning and asked if I would ask you a question, and I think it's a pretty good one. He asked, you've talked a fair amount about how you fused your passion for music with your passion for writing. I know you play and love heavy metal. How would the Vault of Heaven be different if you were a classical musician instead?
Oh, interesting question. What's really interesting is when I moved to Seattle, I moved with a metal band, a band that was very much in the Queensryche vein. But the vocal technique that I studied was classical vocal technique, and most of the guys who I really admire have done the same. Guys like James LaBrie, guys like Jeff Tate, um, I mean Bruce Dickinson. A lot of these folks have actually done formal classical vocal study, and what you learn when you go through that, it isn't notes and theory. There's some of that, but it has a lot to do with how you use the voice. Singing into the mask of the face to get certain resonance in your voice and in the tone that you create to really build longevity into your voice, because if you sing from the throat, you're taxing muscles there and you won't have a lot of endurance, both in a single night of singing and to sing a tour. With good vocal technique, you can do this repeatedly again and again and again and sing athletic regimens like James LaBrie or Jeff Tate does. So when I'm writing the vocal stuff for Vault of Heaven, it's a classical vocal technique that I'm thinking about, and there's places where I've actually had to cut quite a bit. The first draft of Trial of Intentions, huge portions of it read like a textbook, because I went very, very deep and specific on how it works. And some of my early readers said, it's fantastic that you did this, but it's clearly too much for the reader. But I describe the techniques that are being used vocally, and they're built off classical technique, the same kind of stuff that Pavarotti does, or any of the class. And I'm talking about vocal music because the magic system I have is principally, one of the magic systems I have is principally vocal magic. So it really wouldn't change a lot. Now, having said that, the metal side comes in where I describe the part of how the music works as a dysphonic technique. Rock music is known for the great rock scream, the sort of rough, growly, raspy sound, and much of the vocal magic from the principal character sounds like this. So I invented this term, dysphonic technique, to describe it and make it sound, sort of official. And but that is still sung with some of this classical training, and you hear Broadway singers do this all the time. A good example of that is in the original cast recording of Jekyll and Hyde. I think it's Robert. I'm going to screw his name up, but it's like Robert Coulet or something like that. I'll have to look it up. But he does such a masterful job of singing Jekyll and Hyde and making his voice sound like two distinct personalities. And one's got a very clean sound when he's singing Dr. Jekyll, and when he's in Hyde, he's really growling and using his voice more. And that side of things is, it's stereotypically metal, because obviously James LaBrie and Jeff Tate, those guys are not using that very often in their work. But that's the vocal magic. I use that a lot because I think it helps people sort of get at the visceral, the believability of the raw emotions that I'm writing about. So it's a long-winded answer, but to answer that, it really wouldn't change a lot of it because the techniques are grounded in classical vocal technique. But what I do is I layer on, I think, ways that people can understand how this would have the emotional and the sort of raw power that metal does. So
you had that music magic system in the Unremembered, but you kind of ramped it up in Trial of Intentions. Can you talk about how a writer goes about taking something that you've established and kind of evolving it? And do you have an idea of how far that evolution is going to go throughout the series?
Yeah, when I built the world, one of the pieces of world building I did that I spent a lot of time on is something I call governing dynamics, specifically for the magic systems. I think so far I've written 5 magic systems, and there's 1 or 2 of those at least that don't show up until book 3. And there are some others that'll show up later in the series. And they all look and feel and are practiced differently. But the reader, what I think is cool is that the reader will understand, because they're privy to all of them, is that they're all based upon these governing dynamics. And the central dynamic is something I call resonance. And so in Unremembered, it's very lightly touched upon. And when you get to Trial of Intentions, what happens is the main character who does the vocal magic goes to train. And so she starts to actually learn about this principle. At the same time, character goes to this Society of Science where he's got to try and he's going to try and demonstrate or prove something in order to get at a certain goal he has. And he realizes that the way he's going to try and prove this scientific principle is on the back of this notion of resonance. So the reader starts to understand that I've built this something very akin to mechanical law, and I was kind of thinking that way, like gravity or magnetism. But in my world, this idea of resonance it's a thing, and it's the unifying principle upon which all the magic systems are built. But they evidence themselves uniquely by culture, because to me that made sense. Cultures would discover and figure out how to tap into these in different ways over time. So the evolution is it's already kind of mapped out, and what you'll see is as the series progresses, these governing dynamics will sort of be more evident, and the idea of something like resonance will be more evident as you discover more magic systems moving forward. And for folks who haven't read the books or may never read the books, the idea of resonance has a couple of components. There is a notion of energy traversing space, and I posit something akin to ether that I call aramol for the movement of energy through space in a magical attack. But I also, and the larger and part of resonance is much more akin to quantum entanglement. The notion of stirring or changing something at a distance without anything having to move between the two, so they can happen simultaneously, across a world. And this is, in fact, how the veil that holds back, a lot of bad guys. It's how resonance does that work in the book and in the world. So another long-winded answer, but I built all of that early, and I'm just kind of unearthing it for readers as I go.
So you feel like you've actually created that magic system several books ahead then.
Yeah. Now the cool thing, I think, is after I have most of the next book in mind and a good portion of it written, but that's not the end of the series. And so the books that come after that, I only have broad strokes, so there's a lot of room for discovery and invention. But what I'll do is I'll build on top of the principles I've already established. And I won't do that I'll do that for this series. Like the next series, I may abandon this idea of governing dynamics. But for this series, it's how I've done the world building. So I may invent a whole new magic system, and it may have a whole new expression, but I'll work to have it tick and tie with some of the foundational work I've already created.
Cool. So what are some of your favorite magic systems, since we're on the topic? I know you're friends with Brandon Sanderson. He is considered probably the best magic system builder out there maybe right now. But
yeah, Brandon, he's noted for that for sure. It's an interesting question, because despite everything I've just said about the time that I spent building my own magic systems, I don't have a particular affinity for magic systems that are so heavily architected. I'm just as pleased as a reader and delighted to read about a character using magic for which there is no definition or known rules. So everything from Al-Anon, who's a touch point for you and I, that I love, and I don't remember, and I haven't read every single Shannara book, but I don't remember there ever being a detailed cataloging about how, Druid magic works. Clear over to the other side, which is Brandon, who has a set of rules. I don't have them memorized, but Brandon's got rules for magic, not just for himself, but that way he thinks that you should think about them, and they make tons of sense. So for me, those are kinds of ends of the spectrum. I do have an affinity for music magic, just because I'm a musician, but I'm also extra critical there, because I feel like I know enough about music that I want it to feel authentic. I want it to feel plausible. Not that it has to be scientifically explained, but if you play loose with music with me, it's something that'll turn me off as a reader. But that's just a bias of mine.
Right. So, kind of moving away from that, you talked about Al-Anon. You talked about a little bit about Terry Brooks, and Terry, you wrote a blog for Terry's website. Actually, it's going to be publishing next week on release day for Trial of Intentions, and you mentioned the importance of character and how important it is to get character correct. You've written a lot of short stories and of very different characters, all of them, and they're always super well-rounded, and you kind of feel where they're coming from. They're always a middle ground. They're not good. They're not evil. They're somewhere in between. Can you talk a little bit about how you create these characters and how long you'll spend with a character sometimes to actually bring them to life?
Yeah. I usually go, especially in my short fiction. I was talking with someone just the other day about this who's read a lot of my short fiction. I have a lot of my roots in horror. I cut my teeth reading tons of horror fiction. The first short stories and novel I wrote were horror. And so for one reason or another, a lot of my short fiction, not all of it, but a lot of it ends up being rather dark. And the place I go first is to a character's pain, to their inner wounds, because I feel like characters are defined more by those things than they are by their triumphs. And either good or bad. Like they could have gone through something traumatic and challenging and failed and become broken, or worked through it and become stronger. So a lot of times, I think one of the places I'll begin with character development is, the cauldron of garbage that they have been through, to sort of define who they have become when we meet them. And the story that I wrote for Blackguards is essentially an origin story for a rogue, and he's not a rogue with a heart of gold. I mean, he's a bad guy. He's a human trafficker, and the thing I do in that story is I take you into some of the reason why he wound up on this road, and you can decide if you want to feel sympathy for him. And he went through some really, really, really awful stuff, and so at the very least, it's understandable, even if it's not forgivable. And I like exploring that stuff. I mean, I like the lighthearted fare, the stuff that's funny and whimsical, and that kind of stuff. But I'm equally as interested in a character's pain, and usually that's where I begin.
So how does that relate to Ton, then, your main character?
Well, Ton's pain at the beginning of the first book has a lot to do with the fact that he's got a memory loss. That's a fantasy trope, and he's found a kind of solace for himself in sunrise, this moment of a new dawn, and the idea that a new day brings fresh hope, and all of that. What you find is, as his character evolves and you learn more about him, and ultimately has his memory restored to him, is his connection to the sky is much deeper than just, love of sunrise. There's an astronomical connection from the hidden part of his past, and his pain has been that he's felt, this gap has not allowed him to feel grounded, and left him with these questions of identity. And so that's his source of pain. There's a lot of good things about Ton's life too, but then what happens is, in the first book, as some of this stuff becomes revealed, it's very painful when he starts to learn more about who he actually is. I had a reviewer send me a review just within the last couple of days, where they said something really interesting that I hadn't thought of before. That they said they actually see Ton as an anti-hero at this point, having read Trial of Intentions, because they had an arc, and I hadn't thought about it that way, because he's not evil by any means, and he's not self-serving, but I had the distinction of sitting on a panel with Robin Hobb not too long ago, and we were talking about character, and she afforded me the compliment of saying, your characters are really, really flawed. And that's, I do that. That's deliberate. I think you mentioned something about Gray. I am the guy who wants to know who to cheer for in a book, but I don't want that character to be Dudley Do-Right, and nor do I want the villain to be just, Snidely Whiplash. So finding a source, we talked about finding a source of pain, but that doesn't always need to be like molestation. It could be like with Ton, could be the struggle for some sort of anchor that he wants, and then in the process of maybe discovering more about who he is, it's not everything he hoped, right? It's not that he finds the happiness that those lost years he thought might bring him. In fact, there's a lot more pain involved. And in Trial of Intentions, maybe, I don't know if we'll talk about this later, but in Trial of Intentions, one of the topics I deal with is suicide, and this is very much a part of Ton's past and his present. And the book's not about suicide, but it's fair to say that it's a major motivation for him. That's a dark topic, and I get kind of tongue-tied about it, because a friend of mine did this, early in the writing of the book, and I didn't think it affected me as much as it did. I thought I went through the stages of grief and all of that, but when I went back to do edits and I was reading back what I had written, it was pretty clear to me that it got pretty deep into the words, more than I thought. And it was always the case that part of Ton's past had this chapter, and this, but it bubbles up to him in a, and kind of takes him by force, and he winds up very deeply motivated because of it. Anyway, so yeah.
So you are writing sounds like you're almost moving towards grimdark then. If you got an anti-hero rising up in your book series.
I don't know. It's funny because I hear the practitioners, the high lords of grimdark, will sometimes say, I don't even know what grimdark is. The best definition I heard was from Steve Erickson during Comic-Con here a month or two ago. Basically kind of distilled it down to nihilism. I don't know if that's right or not, although Steve's very articulate about this. And I don't know that I would consider what I write grimdark. What I would say though is it's emotionally brutal.
Right.
I'm not trying to beat you up, as a reader with this stuff, but some of the plot lines anyway, they kind of go into some dark territory for these characters. Yeah, so if things like touching on suicide are challenging for you, you might be challenged by the book.
Right. So there's a lot of grittiness there then with all of these characters. Do you have some form of humor, some kind of humor, a humorous character, or somebody to kind of, alleviate that kind of tension? You can't have a reader going through the entire book like dredging,
Yeah, I do. In fact, there's a couple of counterpoints. One of my main characters, Ton, who is the one with the hidden past, who's not hidden anymore, and he's dealing with this heavy topic of suicide. What also happens for him is he discovers, with the reacquaintance of a big part of his past, a big side of his character and personality sort of blossoms. And there's a snarky guy in there. It comes with the confidence of a ton of knowledge and education around, big topics like physics and astronomy and mathematics. And he ends up in these debates. Far from, being in the woods shooting a deer. Here you have a character who is on what I call the discourse theaters, making an argument, a very sophisticated argument, and as he blossoms in this way, he has these interactions with, a character who's kind of pitted against him that I think I love the exchanges there, very sort of pithy and on point. And then I have an entirely different character who has been kind of a bit of a snark from the get-go, and he actually goes a little bit in the other direction. He actually grows up a little bit in Trial of Intentions, where he's kind of at the center of bad things happening because of his incompetence, and he decides that that can't keep happening. So he's still a smartass, but I would say that he grows up. He grows up some in this book, and those are the two examples I can think of where there's some levity amidst all of the heavier content.
So I got a question here from a Simon. He wants to know, do you write or have you written using the pseudonym Alex Marshall?
I don't think so. I had to pause and think because I've written a couple of things, but I don't think I have. There must be some Alex Marshall who Simon feels like I write somewhat like. I don't know.
When you originally, I don't believe you didn't start writing fantasy, did you? You have a couple horror novels under your belt as well. Can you talk about the process that you went through when you were trying to get published, finding an agent, all that fun stuff?
Yeah, the first novel I wrote was a horror novel, and I sent it out, didn't get picked up anywhere. Then I had a short story collection published, small press, and I used that to get an agent. I was with that agent for quite a while, and I won't use the agent's name because he's a very well-known agent. He represents some of my friends that are successful fantasy writers. In fact, the agent's very known for science fiction and fantasy representation, but we weren't a good match. And he knew I loved thrillers and other genre fiction, and I had talked to him about some of the books I wanted to write in those genres, and he steered me towards them. I had sent in the fantasy, the Unremembered. It was under a different name at the time, and he said, let's put that on the shelf, and I want you to focus on your thrillers. In hindsight, I realized he was just trying to diversify his list because he was trying to grow his agency beyond the genres he was already noted for. So I eventually parted ways, and I started marketing, sending out books to other agents, but I was sending the thrillers because those were the most recent things I had written. And I sent them to an agent who liked them, but it was at precisely the time that Da Vinci Code was pretty much dominating the universe, and he just said it's a very tough market. and I said I had a fantasy. He said send it on in. He only represented one other fantasy writer, but he said okay. And he took it and sold it to Tom within just a few days. I had a deal, and off we went with a book that was 10 years old. I was super happy, but you know, the genesis was a couple of short stories, didn't sell anything, wrote a horror novel, didn't sell it, wrote a fantasy novel, couldn't sell it, went on and wrote a bunch of thrillers, those didn't sell, and then I got an agent that went back to the second book I ever wrote, and it sold. I mean, and by the way, that's not a terribly unique story. Every story is like crazy convoluted out there for way people get to publication, but that's my story.
So going back to the pseudonym, would you ever consider publishing those thrillers under a pseudonym, maybe?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. In fact, you know, the only reason I've not brushed those up and tried to get those back out is just time. You know, it's just we talked about the crazy schedule I have to keep. You know, once I get them enough time, I absolutely will do that.
Cool. So
stories.
Good. So you had a story come out. I published one of your short stories. It was very well reviewed in Unfettered. You have another short story coming out in my next anthology, Unbound. They're very different, but I really love the one that's going to be published in Unbound. Just for my own personal curiosity, have you started thinking about your story for Unfettered too?
It's done.
Well,
I just have to send it to you.
Why don't I have it?
Yeah, I just need to send it to you. It's finished. I don't know why I haven't sent it to you.
Right.
Crazy busy. Yeah, it's done. It's set in a place called Abed Grove, which is this community of science I was describing before. That's the setting for it. And the readers I've had for it, you know, have liked it a lot. So I hope you like it.
Right. Kathy wants to know, she loved the song that you made for Unfettered. Is there a way to get it on CD?
I guess you'd have to burn it. Like, we didn't produce any CDs of it. The only way to do that would be to, like, if I didn't send you the MP3, I can. We're not trying to make money off it, except that on iTunes, if you buy it, you know, we're trying to raise money for cancer. I've not received a single statement yet from iTunes, so my suspicion is the fact that we made it available for free. Most people listen to it for free, which is fine. But you could press it. I mean, you know, you could get the MP3 and just burn it, and I don't have any moral compunctions about people doing that. So,
how much fun?
I would if it was actual copyrighted material that I had created for the express purpose of building a career. But I did that song for you, and it was to promote the book and drive the book so we could raise money for you and for cancer. And so that song's a gift, and anybody who wants to listen to it, as far as I'm concerned, is welcome to it.
Why don't you talk a little bit about that song? How much fun did you have creating it, and what did you have to do to prepare to write the lyrics and the music and all that?
Yeah, well, I was, because, you know, you let me, I got to read all of the stories early, and that was fun. I mean, there are some stories in there that I think were award winners. So great anthology. And having read the stories, then what I did was I pieced together a lyrical narrative using little parts from each of the stories. I worked hard to try and make the song hold up on its own, but for people who've read the book, you can kind of pick up the little bits of story. And there's the video. We did a video of it on YouTube, so I literally do the attribution. So if you listen to it on YouTube, you can see the lyric I wrote and which writer inspired it. And it was a lot of fun. That was a lot of work, the lyrics on that, because of what we were trying to do. But it was a lot of fun.
So obviously you've started working on book 3. You probably won't share a title with us yet.
I don't have a title. I honestly don't. I don't have a title for it.
Can you share the original title on Unremembered?
Yeah, it was called The Ledge of Restoration. Not not super musical sounding. That was the original, and we went through a couple of different options, you know, the editor and I, before we landed on the Unremembered.
So obviously you write big epic stories. Um, what is epic fantasy to you? That's kind of the cliche question at a lot of the conventions out there, but I'm curious on your take on it.
Well, I think epic fantasy has to have scale, and it has to have the stakes have to be high. You know, I want to be clear, though, a fantasy book, to be awesome, a fantasy book need not be an epic fantasy. Marketers have decided that the term has cachet. I would love to know if the marketing teams at the various publishers who are slapping that term on those books have done real analysis to know that the attribution of that moniker to a particular book drives more sales. I think that that's an instinctive belief. I've never seen or heard anything that's more informed by data or sales. Nevertheless, there's a lot of epic fantasy termed books that aren't epic fantasy at all in my mind. There's still many of them fantastic stories and fantastic novels. And I have a lot of stories, fantasy stories even, that I want to write that aren't epic fantasy. But for me, epic fantasy's got to involve, you know, it's got to feel big. It's got to have that clashing of ideologies. You know, the stakes are high. That doesn't mean that it can't illustrate large stakes by the intimacy of a single death. Absolutely can do that. Doesn't need to be that you're showing me the death of 10,000 men in order for it to be epic. But the consequences of actions and choices and stuff need to have, I think, repercussions beyond the individual or even, you know, the town for it to be an epic fantasy. And again, it's just a term, largely a marketing term. But if I see something that says epic fantasy and it doesn't deliver on those expectations I've just described, I'm usually, you know, not angry, but it's like I was looking for an epic fantasy. If I was looking for, you know, an urban fantasy, I would have picked up something that said urban fantasy. So I hate the abuse of the term, just because I think readers sometimes get misguided. And readers are savvy. I think they very often know what they want to read. And these are wayfinders. And so if the wayfinders are abused, you know, I just think readers can be frustrated.
So does an epic fantasy need to have magic?
I think any fantasy needs to have magic. You know, we talked about this at Comic-Con on a panel. You know, can a fantasy, is it a fantasy that there's no magic in it? And I tend to think not. Then you get into the sort of gradation of little versus lots of magic, and readers have varying tastes there. You know, some want there to be lots and lots of the fantastic. Others are glad for there to be just a touch of it, and then, you know, mostly it's not about the magic at all. Where I fall, I'm kind of in between. I read books where I felt like the magic was a little bit too much in every sentence I read. On the other hand, if the book reads essentially like an alternate history, and then all we really get is one flash of light, that's not sufficient for me. Not for fantasy, but, you know, if I had, this goes back to your previous question, if I had gone to the store to buy an alternate history, then that would be fine. But that's what I would want the front, you know, the cover or the genre marker to say.
Can you talk a little bit about books that you loved when you were growing up, things that informed you in those early years that kind of pushed you towards being a horror kind of genre fantasy writer.
Um, well, as a young kid, um, the very first book I remember reading was Where the Red Fern Grows, which isn't genre at all. Um, then, as I got into like middle school, I read Sword of Shannara, and that was kind of a watershed moment for me. I went on and read the next couple of Shannara books, and then when I got into high school, um, I kind of wasn't reading a lot of extracurricular fiction. I was doing a lot of English classes, and there's a lot of reading and writing and study there. So that kind of filled that area of my life for a long time. But then when I graduated from high school, I picked up Stephen King's Night Shift in the Honolulu Airport Curio Shop, and I'd never read King before. And a couple of those short stories, they were very impactful on me. Story, The Last Rung on the Ladder, amazing story to me. The Lawnmower Man, there's some humor there, but there's like a little bit unsettling. Some of those stories just, they kind of really catalyzed my desire to write, to be a writer. I mean, I had always had the notion I wanted to write, because from time to time I would put things down. Not usually stories, usually like stream of consciousness things. But after I read Night Shift, I started writing a couple of my own short stories. And when I moved to Seattle, I started my first novel, and naturally it was a very Stephen King-esque horror novel. And then, after I had written that, I had begun to read genre fiction again, and it just tugged at me to want to write something that felt kind of big and and epic. And that's I wrote that in 2000, I think it was.
So you wrote, how many words was the Unremembered?
Well, the first edition, published edition was 312,000. The revision, the author's edition was under 200.
And you still managed to write that book in a year.
Yeah.
Eat your heart out, George R. R. Martin.
Well, that my personal sadness is that I haven't been able to convert to full time yet, because I believe I would be able to put out that I would be a very productive writer given the time.
Right. Speaking of, so basically we need to sell a lot of books.
Yeah.
So you're going to tour for Trial of Intentions, right? And you're going to be going to a couple conventions. Where are you going to be?
Well, I'm going to MissCon this weekend, and over Memorial Day. Going to San Diego Comic-Con. I think we're hanging out. I think you're going, aren't you?
We will be.
I'm gonna do my level best to get to New York Comic Con, because I think that's where you're trying to launch Unfettered 2, and I want to support that. I might. All signs point to me going to Gen Con, which I've never been to before, so that should be cool. I got to work some stuff out with the boss man, and then I'd like to try and get to World Fantasy this year. And then there'll probably be some regional cons that I may try and hit where I don't have to travel so much. But those are the ones that I can think of right now.
And you're going to be touring for the book. You're going to be visiting a couple bookstores.
Yeah, sorry, right. You did ask that. I'm right after MissCon over Memorial Day, because the book comes out. The Trial of Intention comes out on the 26th. I'll be, of course, here locally at U-Books. But then I go to Mysterious Galaxies in San Diego, Borderlands in San Francisco. There's a store I've never been to before. I think it's called Copperfields. It's about an hour north of San Francisco. I do Powell's in Beaverton, Oregon, and then I do Sam Weller's in Salt Lake and a Barnes & Noble in Orem, Utah. And then on the back end, when I get back here, I will probably do one more signing locally. I haven't set anything up yet. So, you know, anybody who's anywhere near any of those places, even if you haven't read the books or don't want to read the books, but just want to come chat, feel free to come out.
Excellent. Well, that's pretty much all the questions I have. You want to say anything extra to the people out there?
Well, I mean, the one thing that I do try and tell folks is I wrote Trial of Intentions as an entry point to the series. There was a long period between books 1 and 2. Some of that had to do with the day job. Some of that had to do with some editor-writer issues, because not all writer-editor marriages are made in heaven. So I fortunately landed with a new editor who's awesome. And so that added to the delay. And I decided, because of the delay, that I wanted Trial of Intentions to be an entry point to the series. So for folks who haven't read any of the short fiction or the Unremembered, don't sweat it. You can actually, if you're interested, you can actually dive right in with Trial of Intentions. You know, if you're interested thereafter, you can go back to the other stuff if you think it makes sense. But I wanted readers not to feel the encumbrance of having to go and do other stuff in order to jump in. So I think that's the main thing. The other thing that I would want folks to know is this idea that I shared, where whether it was a good strategy or not, I had this idea of grounding readers in something familiar, and then, you know, evolving into what I think is unique about my world, which has a lot to do with the music magic system, which many of my readers and reviewers are saying they've never read anything like this. So I feel good about the fact that it seems like a unique approach to magic. The stuff that I bring in this book with all of the science angle, you know, the fact that I've kind of tackled some topics that, at least for me, were I did them as honestly as I could, and you know, they were kind of raw topics for me anyway. They were, you know, and then I have a character in the midst of all this escalation to war, which there's a lot of that in Trial of Intentions. I have a character whose part of his goal is not to try and be the guy who goes and defeats the universe, but rather, can I figure out how to avert war before it begins? And all of which is to say that a lot of the expectations and what readers have found familiar in if they've read the first book, or even in other fantasy books, are things I'm upending. You know, I'm really trying to put them on their heads, and take the reader someplace unique in my world. There's even, like, for people who know my world, there's even a point of view character in the second book in Trial of Intentions that is from kind of the other side. And what you learn is that evil, in quotes, isn't really necessarily what you think evil is. And so it's another place where I'm kind of playing off the reader's expectations, that I've deliberately kind of set them up, because I want them to have the experience of, you know, being surprised, or you know, having those expectations violated. So I'm anxious for people to get in and see that, you know, the evolution. And again, for readers who haven't read the other stuff, you can jump in with this one and just, you know, come along for the ride.
Excellent. Well, to end this, I'm going to ask you just a couple questions that I'm sure are near and dear to your heart. Favorite band?
Favorite band is Dream Theater.
Favorite song?
Favorite song is a song called Red Wine by Mannheim Steamroller. Not metal at all. It bears kind of a sonic similarity to Greensleeves, but is yet quite different. I think that Chip Davis, who is the composer for Mannheim Steamroller is An American Treasure, and I encourage people to go and check out the stuff that he's done. So that's my like bona fide favorite song. I have to say though, another favorite song that is more in the sort of metal world is the song "Pull Me Under" by Dream Theater, and it's as much because it's a great song as because when I heard that song, it also kind of changed my life. I heard that and I thought, my first thought was, oh, I'm just going to give up because I'll never be that good. It was just such an amazing vocal performance. But then it also challenged me, inspired me to go and be that much better at my own music craft. And it's part of what led me to Seattle, because I trained with a vocal trainer in West Seattle for several years before he passed. And that song, it was a watershed moment for me as a musician. So those are my two.
So is your favorite album then something Dream Theater?
Yeah, for a lot of the same reason, Images and Words is that album, because it's the album that Pull Me Under is on. There's a lot of that's a super hard question for me though, because one of my favorite artists is Frank Sinatra. I listen to Frank all the time. I'm also a big jazz fan, and in fact, the only genre of music I don't think I've fully embraced yet is EDM music, and maybe it's because I don't think I'm a very good dancer, and I think you almost have to be a good dancer to like EDM music. But so yeah, when I get to albums and songs, it's super hard. Right now, I've been listening to the new Nightwish album a lot, and This Form's Most Beautiful, which is an amazing album. Folks should check that out.
And what about favorite concert?
Favorite concert I ever went to was, for years and years and years, progressive metal fans had hoped to see a double bill with Queensryche and Dream Theater, and it finally happened. And on tour, so much so that I paid scalper prices for front row, both in Portland and in Seattle. And because both bands are at such a level, depending on the market they were in, they would switch who was opening and who was headlining. In the Northwest, Queensryche did the headlining. And it was interesting because when I went to Portland, Dream Theater just tore it up. And I don't feel like Queensryche ever raised the bar on them. I think they kind of got blown off the stage that night. But when we got to Seattle, and it was the last show of the tour, Dream Theater came out, and they played beyond themselves. And if you know the Dream Theater guys, these are Juilliard graduates and Berklee School of Music graduates. These are not garage guys. These are musicians at the height of the craft, period. Like, not just in metal. And they tore it up. Like, it was as though they were making a statement in Queensryche's backyard. So I was fascinated to see what Queensryche was going to do. When they walked out, they were already trying to get the crowd up. I think they knew that they might, on their home turf, have just gotten blown off the stage. And the first couple of songs, you're like, oh man, they just lost it. And then the third, this is such a geek moment music for me, but in the third tune, they played Empire off the Empire album, and something happened in that hall with that song, and the crowd turned, and it became Queensryche's night, and they played a masterful concert with as much power as I've ever seen them play, and they owned it. Like, people forgot Dream Theater had played, and that's something for me to say because I'm a big Dream Theater fan. So the fact that I got to see two groups with two premier vocalists and musicians at the height of the craft, essentially battling, I don't think I'll ever see a better concert than that.
Well, cool. So Trial of Intentions comes out Tuesday.
26th of May.
Yep, congratulations on the next book publishing and the short stories that people will get to read. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, man. Appreciate it. Been fun.